Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It is a beautiful morning, and it is so wonderful to see so many of you here. My name is Mark Mann, and I serve as the director for the Wesleyan Center in Point Loma Press here at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm one of the co-organizers, along with my compadre Jimmy Gates, standing there in the back. Hi, Jimmy, who is our director for the Center for Justice and Reconciliation here. And in many ways, in all ways possible, was the real visionary for this conference. Although we've had a wonderful collaboration in planning it. My center happens to have a lot more money than his, so the way that I like to put it is that Jamie came up with the idea and I came up with the money. So that and in other ways as well, it's been a wonderful collaboration. Well, very excited to have all of you here. We have guests from around the country, some from around the world. We had one person even fly in last night from Berlin, somebody else from Germany, somebody from Brazil. I mean, just really excited to have so many of you here. And on behalf of Point Loma Nazarene University, I want to welcome all of you, including folks who came from much closer, Los Angeles, here in San Diego, and even some of you who just came across campus who live in the dorms. It's wonderful to have so many Point Loma students here as well. And we're going to get started in just 1 minute. I just want to make one brief announcement, and this is particularly for those of you who are presenters. Make a point to look through your registration packet. We are thinking seriously about putting together a proceedings of the conference as a follow-up, Jamie and I. And if you are one who is presenting while you're here and you're interested in having your paper presentation considered for publication, make a point to look at the directions for submissions that is there in your packet. One other brief announcement. There may be a couple of venue changes, and so keep your eyes open for that. We do our best to kind of plan things ahead of time, but there are all kinds of things that happen that you don't plan on. For instance, having a lot more people register the last 3 or 4 days than you could have possibly anticipated, and so there may be a couple of things that you need to shuffle around. So if that happens, don't be surprised. It's part of, in some ways, the success of what we're trying to do here, and having so many people, so many more people than we had anticipated getting interested. Jamie, is there anything else that I need to or should be announcing? Okay. Well, I'm going to introduce now Ron Benefield, who is our guest MC for this event, and who is used to be a pastor, and then for a while was a professor here at Point Loma Nazarene University, and so he's also a Point Loma alum, so we in many ways consider him one of our own, but who currently serves as the president for Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, and who in some ways within the Church of the Nazarene anyway, within our circle, really embodies in so many ways what this conference is about, through his ministry, through his teaching, and through his the various ways in which he has served as a prophet within our church. And so we're very, very honored to have him as kind of the guest MC to help bring this conference together and move it along. And so I'm going to introduce Ron to you right now. That's Ron, and I just messed up because he's actually not the one who's going to introduce Kathleen Norris, but he will be the one who will be leading the discussion afterwards. Carol Blessing, who is our chair of Literature, Journalism, and Modern Languages, or LJML as we say, and also professor of literature, will be the one making the presentation. I'm sorry, Carol.
It's an honor to be able to introduce Kathleen Norris. Say in the movie Misery, I'm your biggest fan. Kathleen Norris is the award-winning poet, author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Cloister Walk, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, Amazing Grace, A Vocabulary of Faith, and The Virgin of Bennington. Exploring the spiritual life, her work is at once intimate and historical, rich in poetry and meditations, brimming with exasperation and reverence, deeply grounded in both nature and spirit, sometimes funny and sometimes provocative. And I have to say that I appreciate reading her books. I feel like I've kind of gone on this same spiritual journey with Kathleen Norris as I follow those books along. She has published 7 books of poetry. Her first book of poems was entitled Falling Off and was the 1971 winner of the Big Table Younger Poets Award. After that, she moved to her grandparents' home in Lemon, South Dakota, where she lived with her husband, the poet David Dwyer, for over 25 years. The movie was the inspiration for the first of her nonfiction books, the award-winning bestseller, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography. It was a New York Times notable book of the year and was selected as one of the best books of the year by Library Journal. After being a member of and occasional preacher at the Presbyterian Church there in Lemon, in 1986 she became an oblate or associate of a Benedictine monastery, Assumption Abbey in North Dakota. Subsequently, Norris spent 2 years in residence at the Ecumenical Institute at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Her next book, The Cloister Walk, is structured as a diary of her monastic experience, interspersed with meditations on virgin saints, Emily Dickinson, celibacy, loneliness, monogamy, and an hymnist of the early church, Ephraim of Syria. Some reviewers have compared her portrait of the world of the monastics to the writings of Thomas Merton. Her work, Amazing Grace, continues her theme that the spiritual world is rooted in the chaos of daily life. Her intention is to tell stories about more abstract religious concepts by grounding them in the world in which we live. Her book, The Virgin of Bennington, is a narrative in which she shares the period of her life, the young woman before Dakota, from sheltered youth to her entree into the New York art world. She describes the internal and external journey of an artistic young woman trying to find a place for herself amid the cultural tumult of the 1960s and 70s. Other books include Journey, New and Selected Poems, which I have used in one of my classes here, and Little Girls in Church. Most recently, she has published Acedia and Me, A Marriage, Monks, and a Writer's Life in September 2008. It's a study of Acedia, the ancient world for the spiritual side of sloth. She examines the topic in light of theology, psychology, monastic spirituality, and her own experience. She was widowed in 2003, dividing her time now between South Dakota and Honolulu, but primarily Honolulu. Volunteering at her mother's retirement home, also at an Episcopal church where she cooks for a homeless shelter and helps and teaches us spirituality class for teenagers. So let's welcome Kathleen.
Well, thank you. It is great to be back at Point Loma. I was here at the Writers' Conference, I think 7 or 8 years ago, and it's always good to be here. This is a wonderful institution. I'm going to start out. I sort of appeased the Methodist ancestors in my blood by evangelizing for poetry. You have to evangelize for something if you're a Methodist. Poetry is a pretty good way to start. And also, I will be discussing these 2 poems in my talk. The first poem is by the American poet James Wright, and it's from his time in northern Italy in the 70s, I believe. But this is called The Rainbow on Garda by James Wright. The storm crawls down, dissolving the distances of the mountain as though they were nothing. The rain already hangs a gray shawl in front of Bardolino. The town is gone. In the darkness of evening, the darkness of high stone, and a black swallow folding its face in one wing. I too am ready to fold my face. I am used to night, the gray wall where swallows lie still. But I am not ready for light where no light was. Bardolino, risen from the dead, blazing, a scarlet feather inside a wing. Every fool in the world can see this thing and make no more of it than of Christ, frightened and dying in the air, one wing broken, all alone. The second poem I want to read is called Singapore, and it's by Mary Oliver, who I regard as one of our national treasures. She's one of these poets that's been writing for quite some time, and her poems and her prose just get more and more luminous the older she gets, which is pretty nice. And this is actually a fairly early poem called Singapore by Mary Oliver. In Singapore, in the airport, a darkness was ripped from my eyes. In the women's restroom, one compartment stood open. A woman knelt there, washing something in the white bowl. Disgust argued in my stomach, and I felt in my pocket for my ticket. A poem should always have birds in it. Kingfishers say with their bold eyes and gaudy wings. Rivers are pleasant, and of course, trees. A waterfall, or if that's not possible, a fountain rising and falling. A person wants to stand in a happy place in a poem. When the woman turned, I could not answer her face. Her beauty and her embarrassment struggled together, and neither could win. She smiled, and I smiled. What kind of nonsense is this? Everybody needs a job. Yes, a person wants to stand in a happy place in a poem, but first we must watch her as she stares down at her labor, which is dull enough. She is washing the tops of the airport ashtrays, as big as hubcaps, with a blue rag. Her small hands turn the metal, scrubbing and rinsing. She does not work slowly nor quickly, but like a river. Her dark hair is like the wing of a bird. I don't doubt for a moment that she loves her life, and I want her to rise up from the crust and the slop and fly down to the river. This probably won't happen, but maybe it will if the world were only pain and logic. Who would want it? Of course it isn't. Neither do I mean anything miraculous, but only the light that can shine out of a life. I mean the way she unfolded and refolded the blue cloth, the way her smile was only for me. I mean the way this poem is filled with trees and birds. Two poems that I consider beautiful in a way, and that is the topic, When Beauty Speaks, Truth Answers. I am certain that beauty is prophetic. And I was very happy yesterday to hear Father Katongole when he was describing that amazing, and showing the video of that amazing woman, is it Millie? Maggie, who, saw the worst of the slaughter in her country of Burundi, and really saw some of the worst that people can do to each other, and her response was to start an orphanage and love children and really give them an opportunity in life. The first adjective that he used to describe her was beautiful. Yes, beauty is prophetic, because it does what God, really through the prophets, is asking us to do, to see anew, to open our closed, hardened hearts, to truly listen to God, and not all the world's distracting noises about power and wealth, or our own internal self-absorbed chatter. Beauty breaks through our defenses and takes us where we neither expect nor want to go. Thus, beauty partakes of and expresses the prophetic imagination. Beauty can change us, attune us to what is really going on around us, and I think that makes it God's instrument. Also, I suspect that in biblical terms, beauty operates a lot like wisdom. In the Bible, wisdom is with God at the beginning of creation, and St. Paul calls Jesus the wisdom of God. But one thing the Bible makes clear about wisdom is that when we abandon her, when we seek information rather than knowledge, or we value false certitude and comfort over the pain and mystery of experience, when we go our own foolish ways, seeking possessions and power, even when we know better, or we would know better if we were listening to the prophets. When we do those foolish things, wisdom retreats. She leaves us to our own devices and waits for a time when we grow vulnerable again, and she might pierce our hearts and make us see anew. I think that's how beauty works on us as well. Beauty bides her time until she sees a chance to break through our defenses. But beyond that fragile little thesis that beauty is prophetic, I am not certain exactly as how to proceed, except with more poetry and story. I am heartened by Walter Brueggemann's image of Israel in that potent little book, The Prophetic Imagination. He reminds us that throughout history, the people of God are equipped only, this is his quote from him, equipped only with narrative, story, and poem. That's not much of an army, is it? Narrative, story, and poem. And yet he insists these three seemingly paltry things, well-remembered ancient stories and a poetic language with which to speak them, are what enable God's people, and this is another quote from him, to persist long past empire. Brueggemann, like any prophet, is right, and one way we know that is that we are still remembering and telling the stories of Israel and its prophets some 15 centuries after the Roman Empire, and many empires that followed it have collapsed. And now, in what many believe to be the waning days of the American Empire, it is good to hear Brueggemann remind us that the people of God always have to maintain their faith while living within the arrogant, unjust schemes of empire. That is their job. And narrative, story, and poem, along with what he calls the tools of irony, whimsy, and shrewdness, are the means by which Brueggemann says the people of God survive empire and always will. Now, I need to warn you, in case you haven't already guessed, that I am not a linear thinker, so this is not a linear talk. There's no PowerPoint here. I hope you will bear with me as I relate a few stories about beauty and truth. My father often told me that what had turned him into a musician, what really called him to his vocation, was hearing a pipe organ for the first time. He was a Methodist preacher's son and grandson. My great-grandfather was a circuit rider in West Virginia and a chaplain in the Confederate Army. And my father had grown up singing in choirs accompanied by worn and badly tuned pianos in little country churches in West Virginia and South Dakota. But one year his family lived in the town of Mitchell, home of South Dakota Wesleyan, and the church there had a pipe organ. Now, maybe you never thought of Mitchell, South Dakota, or any place in South Dakota as a cultural center. Like Galilee and ancient Israel, it is definitely a backwater on the world's map. Those in power doubt that much good can come from such a place. How can a prophet, how can the Messiah come from Galilee? How can a musician come from Mitchell, South Dakota? But in God's hands, beauty and surprise really can work wonders. Hearing that pipe organ changed my father's life, and I think that's one of the things about beauty, that it not only changes you, but it pushes you into action. It's not inert. Once you change, you realize something else must change in your life. It pushes you to action. And that experience of hearing the pipe organ, that experience of beauty, made my father a musician. His music became his ministry. As a church choir director, a Navy bandmaster, a classical cellist, and finally as a Dixieland band leader whose band's motto was "Playing the Truth in Hawaii." It's a great band. They played at the Hilton Hawaiian Village in the Hyatt Regency, had a great nightclub there, and they played, sometimes they played 7 days a week, 5 days a week. It was a wonderful band, and it lasted for a very long time. Well, my dad was serious, though, about that, playing the truth in Hawaii. He truly ministered through his music. And I think Walter Brueggemann himself could attest to that. He once came to my parents' church in Honolulu as a theologian in residence, and he and my dad really hit it off. I figured out the first time I heard Brueggemann speak, he and my dad shared not only a deep desire for truth and justice, but a wild, free-ranging, and irrepressible sense of humor. Now, I read that James Wright poem partly because he had a similar experience of beauty in an impoverished childhood in an industrial region of eastern Ohio. And I think he was still in elementary school when this happened, but one of his teachers discovered that a symphony orchestra was presenting a concert in a nearby city, and she took a group of students to hear it. Nothing in James Wright's experience had prepared him for that. He later said that the music made him weep because he had not known that such beauty existed in the world. And it changed him. He reached beyond his small, constricted world and against all the odds became a scholar, a teacher who reached thousands of students over the years, and a poet, someone who could see a little town in northern Italy as a swallow near sunset, folding its face in one wing, and then look again to see Bardolino risen from the dead, the city that had been in darkness suddenly revealed in a blaze of sunlight. I think it's important that James Wright reminds us that any fool in the world can see this thing and just ignore it, pass it by. As he says, make no more of it than of Christ frightened and dying in the air, one wing broken, all alone. James Wright wrote many beautiful poems, but I think a lot of what happened to him was inspired by that early experience of a beauty that he hadn't looked for, hadn't known that it existed in the world. In Mary Oliver, that poem Singapore, in which she pokes gentle fun at her reputation as a nature writer, because her poems usually are populated with many more deer and seashells than with people. I love that humble admission of feeling for the airplane ticket in her pocket, that reassurance that she has a way out of this uncomfortable place. But then she looks again, and she becomes something more than a tourist. She becomes a pilgrim and sees this stranger as she really is, as beautiful. And she wonders, amazed at the light that can shine out of a life, any life. And then I think she asks, near the end of the poem, she asks what is perhaps the ultimate prophetic question. If the world were only pain and logic, who would want it? I think the world of empire tries to tell us that everything has to follow, everything has to be logical, everything follows. We'll just sort of shove pain under, we kind of deny pain. But there's Mary Oliver asking, if the world were only pain and logic, who would want it? And my next story about beauty is my own. And to start, I'll read a poem I wrote about an experience I had at the Medieval Institute at Kalamazoo, which I believe is the largest gathering of medieval scholars in the world. I had absolutely no business being there, with my lousy BA in literature from Bennington College. But I was there because of the radical hospitality of the Benedictines. They had asked me as a poet to come to talk about another poet, the 13th century Mechthild of Magdeburg. I'm going to read the poem now, and then I'll discuss a little bit about it. Cinderella in Kalamazoo, the Medieval Institute, 1990. Because this poem set me on a journey certainly as crazy as Cinderella's, and the wild green ride, you know, the pumpkin turning into a coach, all of that. That's kind of the metaphor for this poem. Cinderella in Kalamazoo. Unaccustomed to rain, hills, trees overhead, gentle as a lover's hands, I passed the student center where medievalists crowd the cash bar, pause on the steep path to the dorm, remove my shoes, and am carried for a time on waters deep as liturgy, rain sifting through trees like unexplained tears. Compline has ended, Cistercians observing Bernard of Clairvaux's 900th year sang the Salve Regina to a perfect oceanic stillness. 6'2" and built like a barrel, the hem of his habit rolling like waves onto shore, my unlikely fairy godmother bade me sing. This is not a spectator sport, he boomed, inviting me to learn the chant. And as I joined the others on the wild green ride, our song became conveyance, a glorious means of passage along a narrow road. Can you help me? Asked a monk at the door. Midnight strikes as we move a table into place for morning mass. I'll be gone by then on a flight to the known world, through 2 time zones, my shoes still soggy, to a drought-stricken plain, back to my life, the man I love. I will find it changed, a dusty old house where doors no longer fit their frames. I think the key to that poem is that line about the Cistercian men and women singing, the Trappist monks and nuns basically singing the Salve Regina to a perfect oceanic stillness. I had gone to this far side of the campus because I'd heard that there was a monastic prayer service in the evening, and I had expected to kind of observe from the sidelines. Instead, I was commanded to join in. This is not a spectator's sport, it's the direct quote from the monk who led us in the singing. And at the time, I was shocked way out of my comfort zone. But now I am grateful for that sudden baptism, that full body immersion in Gregorian chant. The Salve Regina is a hymn in praise of the Virgin Mary that ends most every day in a Trappist monastery. I'd never even heard it before. I didn't know how to sing it. I wasn't sure how to pronounce the Latin. But I discovered that's how you learn Gregorian chant, by doing it with people who do know what they're doing. I have pretty good pitch and a decent singing voice, but still learning Gregorian is a bit like trying to roller skate on ice. But you flow along with it. You don't fall because the other voices carry you along, and that's the point. It is an entirely communal activity. Many human voices sounding as one. There is no melody, no beat. So actually knowing how to read music is actually a disadvantage. Because there isn't a melody, there isn't a beat. You never know how long to hold anything except just to hold it as long as the person next to you is holding the note. It's quite interesting. But that music simply flows like a force of nature. And the beauty of it shook me to the core. I knew that something momentous had occurred and that my life had changed. I think my experience had some elements of what Walter Brueggemann calls prophetic, recognizing that the old frames no longer fit, that you need a new way of seeing and hearing without knowing really how it will come or where it will lead. This was in 1990. I was already writing the essays that would appear some 4 years later in my book, Dakota. And I think more to the point of my topic today, I was already collecting material for what would eventually be published as Acedia in Me, nearly 20 years later. Acedia is a word that means supreme indifference. No longer caring about even things that matter to the extent that you no longer care that you can't care. It's a book about the spirit. I describe it as a kind of a spiritual morphine, and I think we kind of survive on that a lot in present-day America. We know the pain and ugliness is there, but we'll do anything to distract ourselves so we don't have to feel it. Our obsession with celebrities, for example, and so-called reality TV can blind us to the ugly realities of everyday life for so many in the world. You didn't know that the United States Army has ground troops fighting in the Philippine jungle? Or that the food needs of unemployed families are stretching food banks all across the country to their limits? It's okay. You can just go back to Access Hollywood, the Shopping Channel, or God help you, Jersey Shore. So my point in telling these stories is to remind us that beauty is formational and foundational. It's a foundation of a lot of change in our life, and it's formative. We need beauty to shake us up, to break open our hard hearts. And isn't it good for us that God's creativity is limitless? God finds is inexhaustible, and God finds limitless ways to reach us through beauty. We can be moved by something in nature, as James Wright discovered in that play of sunlight and shadow in northern Italy. We can find it in each other in ordinary encounters with loved ones or with strangers, as Mary Oliver did in that airport bathroom in Singapore. Worship, of course, can be another avenue to beauty. We can hear the words of a familiar scripture story in a new way, and those words penetrate our thick skulls and numbed hearts. The Bible says our stiff necks don't like that, stiff-necked people. But I suspect that the disturbing wonder of beauty reaches us in church most often through music, because that touches another part of our brain, the pre-verbal. It moves us on a physical level and reminds us that the Christian faith is incarnational. It's a whole body religion and not just a head trip. The beauty and mystery of Gregorian chant, and poetry for that matter, is something that can only be experienced and savored. It can't be fully explained or explained away. And that is part of what makes it prophetic and also deeply unpopular. In the prophetic imagination, Walter Brueggemann describes the mindset of the dominant royal system of the empire as a, quote, a management mentality which believes that there are no mysteries to be honored, only problems to be solved. Surely we recognize ourselves in that description, in our attempts to control and domesticate everything under the sun, including legitimate grief. We'll just hire the grief counselors and they can take care of it. Grief and despair, and even God, despair will just take a pill. well, God, we'll just argue about God and talk about God, but that might help us so we don't really have to live a faith. We'll just argue and talk about God a lot. I mean, try to manage, try to control, try to domesticate even God. It's as if we believe that if we just sound professional enough, fully credentialed and authorized, then everything that disturbs our bogus sense of serenity will simply disappear. George Orwell, who was a true prophet of our language, he gave us the word doublespeak, for instance, which is in the end of the novel, 1984. George Orwell has a passage in his wonderful essay, Politics in the English Language, that reveals our predicament very nicely. Here's a passage that he quotes from the King James Version of Ecclesiastes 9. I saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to those of understanding, nor yet favor of those of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. And here is Orwell's modern translation. And you realize he wrote this probably in the 30s or 40s, a long time ago. But it's still so biting to me. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomena compel the conclusion that success and failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. That's really fun to read. But now remember what Walter Brueggemann says about the language of those who seek to perpetuate unjust systems of control and power. Their language depends on the abstract and the general and avoids the concrete and the specific, whereas the language of the poet and the prophet is just the opposite. It gives us images that we can see, taste, touch, smell, and hear, even when those images are ugly and it is painful to see. Orwell gave us one uncomfortable example of how our own mindset and language have been corrupted. Here's another that reveals that this process has been going on steadily for the last 150 years. Just look at the change in how we describe the damage caused to soldiers by their experience of the violence of warfare. Unimaginable, I think, to anyone who's never been in combat. In the Civil War, people referred to it as soldier's heart. People coming back just stunned and depressed and just, enraged, whatever their reaction was to the war, people knew that they weren't the people who had gone. And when they came back, they talked about them having soldier's heart. Well, after World War I, people referred to shell shock, which referred to the new armaments, the new weapons that had been invented, these exploding shells, and people were shell-shocked after World War I. The veterans of World War II were described as having battle fatigue. Now we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. We've come a very long way from soldier's heart. And I think, that's a sadly evocative term that would be open for anyone to comprehend. It's a metaphor that's really powerful. The heart itself, it's all over the Bible, open hearts, all of that. We've gone from that really evocative term to a clinical medical term, and I see this as an evasion of both beauty and truth. Maybe it's an attempt to describe the condition away. If we just call it, post-traumatic stress disorder, we can hand it all over to the professionals so we no longer have to face it and think about it. Now, one important thing about the prophets in their quest to reveal truth and beauty is they do not run from ugliness, pain, or grief. Sometimes they even embrace the darkness, not to frighten us, but to make us see, to make us sense as they do that, and these are Walter Brueggemann's words, they see that something is on the move in the darkness that even the King of Darkness cannot see. It's God's primordial creative darkness. And there is a term for a thick darkness, really deep darkness. It's only used in the Bible several times. I think when Abram is becoming Abraham, he goes into a thick darkness. There's several other references to it. And one of them is the end of Psalm 88. It's referring to this deep darkness and Psalm 88 is one of the very few psalms, I think one of only two psalms that does not end with a doxology, it ends with a lament. And I heard this psalm read once in a monastery choir, and it really moved me, and I thought, you know, the image was, my one companion was darkness. And I thought, oh, that's a fun note to end on. And sitting there, but what would a darkness as a real companion be? Because a companion is, we think of something as good, and what would that be like? And the other reading that night was from the book of Esther, and both some lines from the psalm and that line from Esther ended up in this poem. Companionable dark, friend and neighbor you have taken away, my one companion is darkness. The companionable dark of here and now, seed lying dormant in the earth, the dark to which all lost things come, scarves and rings and precious photographs, and of course our beloved dead. The brooding dark, our most vulnerable hours, limbs loose in sleep, mouths agape. The faithful dark where each door leads, each one of us alone. The dark of God come close as death, our one companion all the way through, the dark of a needle's eye. Not the easy dark of dusk and candles, but dark from which comforts flee. The deep down dark of one by one, dark of wind and dust, dark in which stars burn. The floodwater dark of hope. Jesus in agony in the garden, Esther pacing her bitter palace, a dark by which we see, dark like truth, like flesh on bone. Help me who am alone and have no help but thee. And those last two lines are from the book of Esther, help me who am alone and have no help but thee. And Esther is alone at that moment, feeling totally powerless in her lament. And yet she signals a total shift in power that puts an end to genocide in the story of Esther. And as I worked her words into my poem, I was reminded of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, you know, when he's praying and really sweating, and he's feeling alone because the disciples are asleep, and that prayer that he makes. So I put him in the poem as well. Jesus in agony in the garden, Esther pacing the bitter palace. Both Esther and Jesus might be seen as fulfilling Walter Brueggemann's idea of a prophetic undermining and dismantling of an arrogant imperial power. Jesus, of course, does this in the most radical way by accepting even death in order to reveal to us the way to new life. So where are we with truth and beauty? I do think that when truth speaks, beauty responds. Walter Brueggemann reminds us that prophetic language, like poetic language, must be lyrical. Here's a quote: speech about hope cannot be explanatory and scientifically argumentative, he writes. Rather, it must be lyrical in that it touches the hopeless person at many different points. Lyrical language is not abstract, and I think that's one of the problems with theology today. We so often just keep repeating abstract words, and even words, important words like oppression and injustice. If we just keep repeating those words, people will start to tune us out. They won't be able to hear us anymore. The task of the prophet or the poet is to put live words out there and then trust the listener to do the rest. It's scary because some will hear and be moved, they be touched in those different places that Brueggemann is talking about. Others will simply turn away, go back to the TV. But when lyrical, living words do connect with people, miracles happen, lives change. We recognize in Brueggemann's terms a newness that we cannot generate. And I think that's the key to all real change and trust in God, that when something happens in our life and we realize, I didn't do that, a newness that only God really could generate. But we really have to struggle to find those fresh words. Way back in the 1960s, Thomas Merton, who was another prophet of the English language, warned us that the overpowering consumerism of American society had corrupted our language so that to say God is love is like saying eat Wheaties. He said that almost 50 years ago. And boy, isn't that true? To say God is love is like saying eat Wheaties. Today, in a world even more permeated by advertising, phrases such as our God is an awesome God have lost much of their power. That word awesome has largely been stripped of its original meaning as dread and righteous fear, becoming an empty word. You can blame surfers for that if you want. They had the Eddie Aikau this year for the first time in 5 years, and there were guys out there surfing 40-foot waves, so awesome might actually be it was an amazing experience. That's a real spiritual thing in Hawaii. It's not just a surf contest. It's a memorial for Eddie Aikau, who died to save his friends. So it's quite a great thing when it does occur. They only go out there when I love this description, when the waves are at least 30 feet and surfable. That surfable being a relative term. But awesome, you know, and it is such a powerful word, but we really have stripped it of so much of its meaning. And it doesn't help that the language of religion itself has become so co-opted by advertising. One of those designers has a perfume called Eternity. And I once saw an ad, this is my favorite, it was a swimsuit that said, "Why pray for a miracle when you can wear one?" I mean, that was actually an ad in Sky Mall. And of course, the depths of depravity for me is actually being bored enough to read Sky Mall. But I was so grateful that day because I cut that out. That's a swimsuit ad. I pray for a miracle when you can wear one. But that makes religious language that much more difficult to express those living truths. But even given those problems, the language of the prophetic imagination is a large part of its power. It also draws power from envisioning, learning to see anew, learning to see again. The prophets, I think, and here's where beauty comes in, they are trying to make us see what God considers beautiful. This is a major theme not only of the prophets, but the Psalms and the Gospels, especially the Beatitudes. This is what God considers beautiful. Isaiah 58 would be a good example of this. We are asked to take a good look at a society in which human needs are met, the hungry are fed, the sick are cared for. No one is left out in the cold on the margins. People are freed from the unjust power and control systems we've created and so often treat as if they are eternal, just the way things are. We may have created a desert for ourselves and called it good, especially if the status quo benefits us, but God insists on making and watering a new garden where all are welcome and cared for as God's beloved. That's what God considers beautiful. And there's a little footnote I'll make here about, you know, we look at our economic system, we look at the way we do things, and we think, well, that's just the way things are. And I tell this story in Acedia. I book Acedia, but I grew up in an America where homelessness didn't exist. Really very little homelessness, certainly not the epidemic that we see on our streets. And I remember I went to India in 1968 and I was thinking, isn't this, it's so good to live in a country where we don't have beggars on the streets, we don't have a lot of panhandlers, we don't have all these homeless people. Because in India in 1968 they certainly did. In America there were skid rows where alcoholics were, but panhandling some like the Old Bowery in New York City, but even most of those unfortunate people had a place to stay at night, maybe a Salvation Army shelter. But in the 80s, really, the homeless epidemic began in our country, but now people just think, well, that's the way it is. And that's the way it always has been. That's the way it is. That's not the way it is. That was created by human beings. It can be uncreated. It can be unmade. And so I think Wendell Berry complains about how often we regard economic realities as the laws of God. We assume that they're eternal and they're not. Well, the prophets offer us an image of a society that we are asked to hope for and work for, knowing that while we may never see it come to pass, it is always worth envisioning. And I love this quote from Brewed. Questions of implementation, he reminds us, are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. And he wrote that back in '78, but I think it's even more true today. It's important to remember that the prophets are all about hope, but they do not traffic at all in optimism. Biblical hope requires envisioning a common good for God's people. We look around at all the injustice around us, all the opportunities missed, all the people that could be nourished as children in inner cities and rural areas, isolated rural areas, and they're not given those opportunities. Biblical hope requires imagining and envisioning something better for all people, the common good. But I think optimism merely settles for a slightly better version of the status quo, especially as it benefits me. I just encountered a new slang term that says it all, shoptimism. Shoptimism. Just buy more stuff and you'll feel better. And I think if you follow that road long enough, you're going to end up smack dab in a city and you won't be able to care about anything of importance. Shoptimism. I love slang. It's just so, actually, slang can be quite prophetic. It can tell us where we really are. And shoptimism is a great one. Well, I would recommend turning to Walter Brueggemann any time to better understand the prophets, but also to give them better press. He makes it clear that these people called by God really don't fit the stereotype that we so often make of them. Oh, they're just these angry, judgmental ranters. You can turn to Glenn Beck for that. Brueggemann reminds us that the prophets do not simply harangue, scold, or reprimand us. They're much more anguished than they are angry, especially Jeremiah. He is really the prophet of grief and anguish. And it's in the prophet's anguish over the way that human beings treat each other that the prophets mirror God's compassion. Like God, they see what is wrong with us, the out of balance and distorted fantasies of power and well-being that we call normal, and they want us to see it too. Walter Brueggemann calls our attention to the compassion of Jesus Christ within the prophetic tradition. He considers the crucifixion as the decisive event in that tradition and in our life of faith. It is a full flowering of both the criticism of social injustice and also the energizing and even beautiful vision of the new that all prophecy contains. It's what Brueggemann calls the full expression of the dismantling that has been practiced and insisted upon in the prophets since Moses confronted Pharaoh. That's a long thread to pull in the Bible, from those stories in Genesis through the prophets and into the Gospels, but it is there for us to see and to hold on to. And I think that's a good image for us to take with us into Holy Week. The dying Jesus is a potent sign of the destruction of worldly power. But it will be hard to keep this truth alive as we face down those baskets full of trinkets, plush bunnies, and sugar eggs in the shopping malls. In a culture devoted to denying death, it's difficult to assert that any death has meaning, and that from this death in particular, we find a sure sign of God's compassion for us. In this death is truth. In this, we find the hope, faith, and love that makes life truly beautiful. And I want to end, as I did, on a kind of benediction. I'll end with a couple of poems as well. There's one that's just a poem of witness that I love. And I love it partly because it's a deconstructionist poem. The model of it is kind of to deconstruct an old, this is the house that Jack built. It deconstructs it, but it also just proves the theory of deconstructionism, which I love. It's a house that Fear built, Warsaw, 1943. It's a poem by Jane Flanders. And this is it starts with an epigram by Czesław Miłosz, the Polish-American poet. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person, for our house is open and there are no keys in the doors. And it's based on a famous photograph from World War II that's been reprinted in a lot of history books and textbooks of a little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto, and there's a soldier with a rifle and his hands are up, and all the people around him are showing periods of terror and everything. But this is such a witness. I love this poem. The House That Fear Built, Warsaw, 1943. I am the boy with his hands raised over his head in Warsaw. I am the soldier whose rifle is trained on the boy with his hands raised over his head in Warsaw. I am the woman with lowered gaze who fears the soldier whose rifle is trained on the boy with his hands raised over his head in Warsaw. I am the man in the overcoat who loves the woman with lowered gaze, who fears the soldier whose rifle is trained on the boy with his hands raised over his head in Warsaw. I am the stranger who photographs the man in the overcoat, who loves the woman with lowered gaze, who fears the soldier whose rifle is trained on the boy with his hands raised over his head in Warsaw. The crowd of which I am each part moves on beneath my window, for I am the crone, too, who shakes her sheets over every street in the world, muttering, "What's this? What's this?" Prophets require people who see and say, "What's this? What's this?" And I guess I'll close with one of my own poems. And it's ironic, this is a poem that actually began out of reading an article in the New Yorker about a massacre in El Mozote in El Salvador. And what struck me at the time, and in fact I used this, I was working on an essay on the Virgin Martyrs, and what struck me at the time was how this young woman's death was almost identical. The way the soldiers had testified about it, because there was a trial, that people were tried for this massacre. The way they testified about her death was almost identical to the deaths of the Virgin Martyrs back in the first and second centuries. It was really uncanny. Because the only way to kill a holy woman is to knife her. You can't shoot her, you can't strangle her, you can't. That's the only way it works. And in case you ever want to know, kill a holy woman, that's what works. But I mean, the stories are pretty gruesome, but they have a point, and I was just so struck by this and what happened to the soldiers afterward, and that's what they testified to afterward. The soldiers argued, did she prove that God exists? The corpse of a girl, 13 at most, lies bloodied on a hill named for the cross of Jesus Christ. Nothing left of her voice, crying out, small as a bird, singing hymns as they raped her one long afternoon, the others already dead. 23 children, bayoneted, left to burn, the old hacked and shot, fallen in the dust of the village square of El Mozote. God speaks like fire, God's words are a sword. The soldiers are stunned, too sated with death to move. When one finally shot her, she kept on singing, her voice a bit weaker than before. Another shot, and still she sang, and the soldiers became afraid. One unsheathed his machete and hacked through her neck until at last the singing stopped. Afterward, they argued, does she prove that God exists? The soldiers are afraid, and it burns within. Is it fear or singing that has no end? And of course, as Christians with the book of Revelation, we are convinced that it is singing that has no end. That's what we're told, and that's what one would like to believe, but I was fascinated by that was what they argued about, and I can just imagine these men, crazy with violence, suddenly talking about God, as God exists, and wondering what is it they've done. I mean, it was really, it's a very powerful story in the New Yorker, and that inspired that poem. And maybe I'll end on a happier note. Just something of a very ordinary beauty. Two poems, actually. There's a Psalm 45, which is considered the wedding psalm. My heart overflows with noble words. The woman is standing before me in the gold of Ophir, which is the place, I guess, where gold came from in ancient Israel. This is called Gold of Ophir. In the dawn, homing nighthawks pass, a pale sliver of moon on the rise. A horse snorts in the near dark, a killdeer keens, a meadowlark embellishes the air, and the sun, thunderous silence, touches trees and rooftops with gold. Barefoot in the morning chill, my neighbor stands smoking. On her back porch, teenager with a newborn, the father in jail. Bewildered, proud, dazzled by new passion, she takes me in and shows me her daughter, who sleeps grandly like a queen. God can turn anything good. And the last one is Body and Blood, and somebody mentioned this poem last night, and again, it's finding beauty when you least expect it, and in a very ordinary place, body and blood. I am worn, spent, torn with sorrows, still I walk in the blue light of dawn, and the sky upholds me. A crescent of moon, a wing of cloud, deep crimson ascends in the east, tinting even the western sky. Stupid with worries, and they are legion, I stop to admire the weedy hollyhocks by a neighbor's backyard fence. I hear the bumblebee before I spot him entering a blossom, his body quivering like an infant's mouth at the breast, drinking the milk of the world. Thank you.